Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. In the most recent episode of The Bad Batch, we find out that Project War Mantle is not only well on its way to producing a new class of TK class troopers, but we also find out that an old Clone Wars favorite, the Clone Commandos, are the individuals responsible for training these future bucketheads. Now I'm a bit torn about this situation, as you guys all probably know already. I'm a huge fan of the Republic Commando series, and I generally really enjoyed following the story of these badass Special Forces clone warriors. Now, Dave Filoni, the maker of The Bad Batch, is one of the main reasons why Legends figures are now once again re-emerging in Disney's canon. While producing the Clone Wars TV show, he brought back Delta Squad, which was a clone commando unit not from the Republic Commando novels, but from the very underrated Republic Commandos video game. Dave Filoni is kind of like George Lucas's original understudy. He was very much his protege, and they spent a lot of time together developing things. And so I always appreciate it when Dave Filoni can bring back some of that expanded universe content that a lot of the older fans probably grew up with and now really cherish as part of their own headcanon. But being a huge fan of that old content, I always have problems with how Filoni changes old characters, like Thrawn, and turns them into a more simplified version of what they once were. I mean, part of the problem is that Dave Filoni generally works with animation on shows that try to target kids a bit more, so things are a bit more simplistic there. This is why instead of seeing the complicated and nuanced character that Thrawn is in the Timothy Zahn novels, Thrawn just kind of becomes some kind of cartoonish evil bad guys in Rebels who gets eaten up by space whales. I actually have a very similar concern about Dave Filoni bringing back the Clone Commandos to canon. You see, Clone Commandos don't really make the ideal trainers for the future Stormtrooper Corps for a lot of reasons. And I'm not sure if Dave Filoni is going to keep those reasons intact for the sake of servicing whatever story he's trying to create here. In order to really understand the Clone Commandos, though, we have to go to the very beginning, and that is to their creation. In the beginning, there was only Jango Fett and an idea to create a massive military force from his DNA. The Kaminoans were expert cloners, but before this contract, they had mainly focused on small batch, high quality, and highly customized orders. They were basically a boutique clone shop when compared to the larger mass production retail clone outfits. The Kaminoans actually lacked experience with human DNA and cloning, and so they began to experiment with a few different batches of clones before making the rank-and-file vanilla versions that would make up the entire Grand Army of the Republic. The first batch of clones that the Kaminoans made were known as the Null-class Arcs, and even at a very young age, they were already deemed as a complete failure. This is because of a variety of reasons, including the fact that they were way too independent and essentially uncontrollable. We have to remember that Kaminoans are complete control freaks, and so when they say uncontrollable, well, they have a different standard of what that means, in my opinion. The Kaminoans also wanted to terminate these adorable little Fett clones, which would have been a terrible waste. Fortunately, an old Mandalorian mercenary by the name of Cal Scarada steps in and agrees to raise and train them. The Clone Commandos were a reaction to the failure of the Null Arcs, and so they were genetically altered to be more loyal and susceptible to following orders without questions than the Null Arcs. But at the same time, they were more independent thinkers than the standard clones, making them very unpredictable on the battlefield. These clones were raised and trained in pods of 4. Developing a close bond with their squad mates was important because commandos were almost always deployed alone in their squads behind enemy lines. Unlike the Null Arcs, who mainly operated on their own and encountered more espionage and covert operation type scenarios, the Clone Commandos, for all intents and purposes, were designed for direct action, aka kicking down doors and taking out targets. And so when it comes to foreign internal defense missions like training friendly allies on how to fight and soldier, you're actually more likely to see a Null class or Alpha class ARC trooper fulfill this role than a Clone Commando. The Clone Commandos' field of expertise mainly was weaponry, tactics, and guerrilla warfare. It would actually be quite beneficial for most Stormtroopers or Clone Troopers to learn from these beefed up Clone Commandos. They are experts at killing things, but at the same time, it's kind of overkill. These Clone Commandos are just trained for situations that the Imperial military realistically won't encounter much. For now, the Empire really just needs a massive peacekeeping force. More importantly, the Clone Commandos were all trained by one of Jango Fett's Kuul Valdar. This was a collection of 100 mercenaries who personally trained several pods of commandos themselves. This is very different from the style of training that the rank-and-file clones had underneath the Kaminoans. Most of the Kuul Valdar were also Mandalorian mercenaries. I mean, there were also Corellians and other cultures represented amongst the trainers, but it was mainly Mandalorians. And so it was very inevitable for these Mandalorian mercenaries to pass down their traditions and cultures to their clone charges. And many Clone Commandos would eagerly adopt a Mandalorian way of life to kind of fill that empty void where their own ethnic and cultural background should be. It also should be mentioned that the Mandalorian way of life is very much already in line with the lifestyle a badass operator like a Clone Commando might experience. And so units like Omega Squad and Delta Squad spoke to each other in Mandalorian. They adopted Mandalorian traditions and mindsets and customs. Individuals like Cal Skirata would make sure his commandos were independent-minded and took care of themselves and each other first and foremost. Cal Skirata's Clone Commandos were very wary of the Republic transition to the Empire. This is why they already had a plan in place to defect from the Empire if things got kind of sketchy, and most of Cal's commandos eventually would make it to Mandalore. But then again, even during the Republic era, the Clone Commandos were a bit of a handful. They had accumulated a huge amount of wealth stored in personal banking accounts. They had a large arsenal of private weapons and vehicles and properties to store their goods. The Clone Commandos were much less dependent on the military than the rank-and-file clones were, which is why it was so easy for them to defect in the first place. So on the planet of Daro, Project War Mantle has begun, and training these new TK troopers were around 50 Clone Commandos. Now, it's very possible that you have some Clone Commandos who weren't trained by Mandalorians and were just trained by, I don't know, like Corellian mercs or some other mercenary who doesn't have a strong ethnic or cultural background that they can share with these Clone Commandos that would make them more independent-minded and spirited. It is possible that there are 50 Clone Commandos who will stay loyal and obedient to the Empire. That is, after all, what the Kaminoans conditioned them to be like. Commando units like the Iowa Squad showed extreme obedience during Order 66 and executed it without hesitation. They're more like Crosshair Commander Cody. They're all about the orders and following them to the T. But then again, you have units like Omega Squad where their demolition expert knocks up their Jedi Commander. Which means that love can be found anywhere, even on the battlefield, in between a commanding officer who's also a teenage girl and an enlisted soldier who's actually 9 years old but looks like a full-grown adult. You also have the case of Clone Commando Gregor, who refuses to train the TK troopers. He suffered from some slight brain damage after surviving a massive explosion during the Clone Wars. He clearly was not enjoying his time on Daro and tries to escape his duties there. The pattern here is Clone Commandos have a mind of their own, and they will not react positively to the Imperial style of order and structure. Which makes sense because Clone Commandos are badass special operators. They go behind enemy lines, they're cut off from their commanding officers, and the orders they receive are the ones they make for themselves. Technically, the Bad Batch is also supposed to be a Clone Commando unit as well. I mean, they have similar armor and weapons to the other Clone Commandos. They also clearly have some problems following orders. So I think it's definitely possible for more Clone Commandos on Daro to have issues with the TK Trooper program. As the Empire becomes more restrictive, the Clone Commandos will probably be more uncomfortable in these types of situations. This makes me wonder why the Empire didn't just take regular clones who are obedient and have them train the Stormtroopers as well. I mean, I know that is something that happens later on in canon. I guess it is possible that, like any new brand or product though, the Empire wants to focus on creating an elite version of the TK Troopers first, and so they have to rely on Clone Commandos. It's possible that over time, once they have their methods established, they'll mass produce much more lower quality Stormtroopers, which is exactly what happens with the Empire anyway. But for now, the Empire has to rely on these Clone Commandos, or at least mutant Clone Commandos like Crosshair, to continue leading these new, very green enlisted soldiers into battle. But as more clone mutinies begin to spring up across the galaxy, it'll become even harder for these Clone Commandos to stay loyal to the Empire. At the same time, the Empire will need to speed up Project War Mantle as much as possible so that they can get rid of all of these disloyal clones and start a new military. So there you have it, guys. I am concerned that Dave Filoni will make the Clone Commandos fit the narrative that he wants, which could potentially also destroy what they stand for. I think it's possible that he'll walk kind of middle road and still keep Delta Squad and Omega Squad as something that is canon, but they are going to be the exception to the rule, and most Clone Commandos are going to just be following orders and, you know, very rigid, like this guy behind me over here. But let me know in the comment section below what you think is going to happen. Do you think the Clone Commandos are, you know, perfect for training Stormtroopers? Let me know. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.